Well, good morning. The Senate Armed Services Committee meets this morning to receive testimony on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2018 budget request. We welcome Secretary Mattis, Chairman Dunford, Secretary Norquist, and thank you for your many years of distinguished service and your leadership of our men and women in uniform. Before we begin, we all want to acknowledge the service and sacrifice of Sergeant Eric Houck, Sergeant William Bays, and Corporal Dylan Baldridge. These three soldiers from the Army's 101st Airborne Division were killed this weekend in Afghanistan. The thoughts and prayers of this committee are with their loved ones. The sacrifice of these heroes is a painful reminder that America is still a nation at war. That is true in Afghanistan, where after 15 years of war, we face a stalemate and urgently need a change in strategy and an increase in resources if we are to turn the situation around. We also remain engaged in a global campaign to defeat ISIS and related terrorist groups from Libya and Yemen to Iraq and Syria, where U.S. troops are helping to destroy ISIS and reclaim Mosul and Raqqa. Meanwhile, threats around the world continue to grow more complex and severe. North Korea is closing in on the development of a nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile that can target our homeland. And Iran continues to destabilize the Middle East and seek to drive the United States out of the region. At the same time, we've entered a new era of great power competition. Russia and China, despite their many differences, are both modernizing their militaries, developing advanced capabilities to undermine our ability to project power globally, threaten their neighbors, and challenging the rules-based world order. Russia, in particular, continues to occupy Crimea, destabilize Ukraine, threaten our NATO allies, bolster the murderous Assad regime in Syria, and pursue a campaign of active measures to undermine the very integrity of Western democracies. With thousands of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines deployed in harm's way around the globe, those of us who are charged with the awesome responsibility of providing for the common defense must ask ourselves if we are doing everything possible to support our brave men and women in uniform to meet the challenges of an increasingly dangerous world and succeed in their mission. I'm sad to say that we are not. In response to rising threats, we have asked our military to do more and give more, but have given less and less to them. Our witnesses' opening statements are a harsh indictment of this failure, but they are right. I implore my colleagues to listen carefully to their testimony and heed their admonition to us. Since 2011, spending caps mandated by the Budget Control Act have led to a 23% cut to the defense budget. These reductions, compounded by growing fiscal uncertainty and continuing resolutions, have left our military with shrinking forces, depleted readiness, and aging equipment. This has put the lives of our men and women in uniform at greater risk, as this committee has heard in testimony for years from our civilian defense leaders and senior military officers. The administration's fiscal year 2018 budget requests, if enacted, could help to arrest the decline in our military's readiness, but ultimately and unfortunately, it falls short of the President's commitment to rebuild our military. The proposed defense budget of $603 billion is both arbitrary and inadequate. Arbitrary because the top line is simply what was written into the Budget Control Act 6 years ago, prior to the sequester cuts, and inadequate because it represents just a 3% increase over President Obama's defense plan. It is hardly surprising, then, that this committee has received lists of unfunded requirements from the military services totaling over $31 billion, all of which Secretary Mattis testified last night in the House Armed Services Committee that he supports. Our military service leaders have testified to this committee that this budget would staunch the bleeding, but we owe our men and women in uniform more than that. It's been said that this budget request focuses on readiness, and it is true that the requested funding increases would make the current force more ready for the next year. But ultimately, readiness is more than training hours and time on the ranges. Real readiness requires sufficient capacity to enable our troops simultaneously to conduct operations, prepare for deployment, rest and refit, and focus on the challenges of tomorrow. This budget delivers no growth in capacity, which means that the joint force will continue to consume readiness as quickly as it is produced. These increases in capacity are reflected in each service's unfunded requirements. True readiness is also modernization, because if we mortgage future capability pay for present commitments, we have achieved little, especially at a time when our adversaries are moving at an alarming rate to erode America's military technological advantage and call into question our ability to project power. Here, too, unfortunately, this budget request poses the old false choice between readiness and modernization. The fact is that $603 billion simply is not enough to pay for both priorities, which is why the service's unfunded requirements are heavy on the procurement of new and additional capabilities that are desperately needed. All of this presents this committee and this Congress with a significant choice. The administration's budget request is just that, a request. Ultimately, it is our independent responsibility to authorize and appropriate funding for our military at levels and in ways that we believe sufficient to provide for the common defense. I believe that this budget request is a start, but we can and must do better. This will not be possible, however, as long as the Budget Control Act remains the law of the land. This defense budget request and the additional funding that our military needs is literally illegal under the Budget Control Act. This law has done severe damage to our military. It has harmed the department's ability to plan and execute budgets effectively and efficiently. It has ground the Congress's budget and appropriations processes to a halt. And worst of all, there are 4 more years of BCA caps to go. We cannot go on like this. Our men and women in uniform deserve better. It is time for the Congress to reinvest in our military, restore readiness and capabilities, rebalance our joint force, and renew America's military advantage. To do so, we must revise or repeal the Budget Control Act, and we must give our troops what they need to succeed today and in the future. Will the politics of this be difficult? Yes. But the question all of us here must answer is, how much longer will we send our sons and daughters into harm's way, unprepared, before we get over our politics and do our jobs? Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to consider funding levels of the Department of Defense to maintain our nation's military. I also want to welcome our distinguished witnesses this morning, thank them for the service to the nation. I want to join with the chairman in paying tribute to the soldiers of the 101st who gave their lives and their families. They are examples of thousands and thousands of Americans who serve and their families here at home that serve with them. Today we consider the fiscal year 2018 Trump administration budget that seeks $574 billion in base funding and $65 billion for overseas contingency operations. As we all know, the Budget Control Act, the BCA of 2011, and the sequester are still the law of the land, and this budget request for DOD exceeds the BCA's defense spending cap by $52 billion. Rather than negotiate with Congress or propose an outright repeal of the BCA and the sequester, President Trump proposed to offset an increase in defense spending with a $52 billion cut in non-defense spending. But unless the BCA is changed, the offset will seriously harm non-defense spending and fail to prevent across-the-board cuts reclaiming the $52 billion, leaving DOD in a worse position. We have already held many hearings this year where senior civilian and military leaders have repeatedly urged us to remove the BCA caps and end sequestration. Like Chairman McCain, I believe it is time to repeal the BCA. Setting arbitrary spending thresholds on defense and non-defense spending has not made our country safer, and it has not fixed our broader fiscal problems. Nor do these caps, which were set nearly 6 years ago, accurately reflect what our military needs in order to confront today's threats, or the kind of domestic investment we need to keep America competitive and strong. Let me be clear, I am not opposed to increased military spending. Democrats have and will continue to support robust defense spending. But it is the duty of this committee to carefully review the budget proposals presented by the President to ensure that the funds are allocated properly so that our fighting men and women have what they need to complete their mission and return home safely. Every member, regardless of party, takes this duty seriously. I also believe that our budget must reflect our nation's core values and take care of Americans who remain at home. Our military personnel have a vision of the America they are fighting for, and it is our duty to protect that. I therefore have grave concerns about the President's budget request because it robs from Peter to pay Paul. The President's proposal increases defense spending, but it also eliminates $17.3 billion from the State Department's efforts to prevent wars and foster peace, which is the very kind of spending that Secretary Mattis has said is so crucial to our military efforts. It also slashes funding for health investments like the NIH and CDC and training for healthcare professionals to fight against global public health epidemics such as Ebola before they reach the U.S. This budget request also eliminates programs that help vulnerable Americans here at home. Certainly, our military needs additional resources to climb out of the readiness hole it is in and at the same time deter conflict with near-peer competitors, but I do not believe we should do so at the expense of diplomacy and vulnerable Americans. I would also know that for over the last 15 years, we have found it important enough to send our brave men and women to war, but we have not had the courage to raise revenues to pay for these wars, as this nation has historically done. As we examine what funding requirements are necessary for the safety and security of our country, we need to look at our federal budget in a much broader context. The BCA's delineation between defense and non-defense spending has had the unfortunate effect of pitting each category of funding against the other. Instead, we'll be better served if we consider the needs of our nation holistically. I also believe that it would be best if we examine the President's budget request in the context of an overall national security strategy. Such a strategy, however, has not clearly emerged as we enter the 6th month of this administration. We seem to careen from one foreign policy crisis to another, many of which are the administration's own making. This takes up valuable energy and attention at a time when there are several significant national security challenges on which we need to be focused. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, you have been consummate professionals and steady hands in a tumultuous time. But we face many difficult decisions, both strategic and budgetary, that demand the kind of leadership and engagement that only a grounded and focused president can provide. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues as we address these important issues. I'm proud that this committee has always worked in a bipartisan fashion during this process. And I look forward to working with the chairman and all the committee members to come to a reasonable agreement again this year. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Mattis, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2018. Mr. Chairman, I request the committee accept my written statement for the record. I am joined by Chairman Dunford and the Department's new Comptroller, Undersecretary of Defense David Norquist. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for your swift consideration and the Senate's confirmation of Defense Department nominees. This budget request holds me accountable to the men and women of the Department of Defense. Every day, more than 2 million service members and nearly 1 million civilians do their duty, honoring previous generations of veterans and civil servants who have sacrificed for our country, and it's my privilege to serve alongside them. We in the Department of Defense are keenly aware of the sacrifices made by the American people to fund our military. Many times in the past, we have looked reality in the eye, met challenges with the help of congressional leadership, and built the most capable war-fighting force in the world. There is no room for complacency, and we have no God-given right to victory on the battlefield. Each generation of Americans, from the halls of Congress to the battlefields, earns victory through commitment and sacrifice. And yet, for 4 years, the Department of Defense has been subjected to or threatened by automatic across-the-board cuts as a result of sequester, a mechanism meant to be so injurious to the military it would never go into effect. but it did go into effect, and as forecast by then Secretary of Defense Panetta, the damage has been severe, hollowing out our force. In addition, during 9 of the past 10 years, Congress has enacted 30 separate continuing resolutions to fund the Department of Defense, thus inhibiting our readiness and our adaptation to new challenges. We need bipartisan support for this budget request. In the past, by failing to pass a budget on time or to eliminate the threat of sequestration, Congress sidelined itself from its active constitutional oversight role. Continuing resolutions coupled with sequestration blocked new programs, prevented service growth, stalled industry initiative, and placed troops at greater risk. Despite the tremendous efforts of this committee, Congress as a whole has met the present challenge with lassitude, not leadership. I retired from military service 3 months after sequestration took effect. 4 years later, I returned to the department, and I have been shocked by what I've seen about our readiness to fight. While nothing can compare to the heartache caused by the loss of our troops during these wars, no enemy in the field has done more to harm the combat readiness of our military than sequestration. We have only sustained our ability to meet America's commitments abroad for our security because our troops have stoically shouldered a much greater burden. But our troops' stoic commitment cannot reduce the growing risk. It took us years to get into this situation. It will require years of stable budgets and increased funding to get out of it. I urge members of this committee and Congress to achieve 3 goals. First, fully fund our request, which required an increase to the defense budget caps. Second, pass a fiscal year 2018 budget in a timely manner to avoid yet another harmful continuing resolution. And third, eliminate the threat of future sequestration cuts to provide a stable budgetary planning horizon. Stable budgets and increased funding are necessary because of 4 external factors acting on the department at the same time. The first force acting on us that we must recognize is 16 years of war. When Congress approved the all-volunteer force in 1973, our country never envisioned sending our military to war for more than a decade without pause or conscription. America's long war has placed a heavy burden on men and women in uniform and their families. A second concurrent force acting on the department is the worsening global security situation that the chairman spoke about. We must look reality in the eye. Russia and China are seeking veto power over the economic, diplomatic, and security decisions on their periphery. North Korea's reckless rhetoric and provocative actions continue despite United Nations censure and sanctions, while Iran remains the largest long-term challenge to Mideast stability. All the while, terrorist groups murder the innocent and threaten peace in many regions while targeting us. A third force is adversaries actively contesting America's capabilities. For decades, the United States enjoyed uncontested or dominant superiority in every operating domain or realm. We could generally deploy our forces when we wanted, assemble them where we wanted, and operate how we wanted. Today, every operating domain, outer space, air, sea, undersea, land, and cyberspace, is contested. A fourth concurrent force is rapid technological change. Among the other forces noted thus far, technological change is one that necessitates new investment, innovative approaches, and new program starts that have been denied us by law when we have been forced to operate under continuing resolutions. Each of these 4 forces, 16 years of war, the worsening security environment, contested operations in multiple domains, and the rapid pace of technological change, requires stable budgets and increased funding to provide for the protection of our citizens and for the survival of our freedoms. I reiterate that security and solvency are my watchwords as Secretary of Defense. The fundamental responsibility of our government is to defend the American people, providing for our security. And we cannot defend America and help others if our nation is not both strong and solvent. So we in the Department of Defense owe it to the American public to ensure we spend each dollar wisely. President Trump has nominated for Senate approval specific individuals who will bring proven skills to discipline our department's fiscal processes to ensure we do so. This first step to restoring readiness is underway thanks to Congress's willingness to support the administration's request for an additional $21 billion in resources for fiscal year 2017 to address vital warfighting readiness shortfalls. Your support put more aircraft in the air, ships to sea, and troops in the field. However, we all recognize that it will take a number of years of higher funding delivered on time to restore readiness. To strengthen the military, President Trump requested a $639 billion top line for the FY 2018 defense budget. This year's budget reflects 5 priorities. The first priority is continuing to improve warfighter readiness begun in 2017, filling in the holes from trade-offs made during 16 years of war and 9 years of continuing resolutions and Budget Control Act caps. The second priority is increasing capacity and lethality while preparing for future investment driven by the results from the National Defense Strategy we are working on now. Our fiscal year 2018 budget request ensures the nation's current nuclear deterrent will be sustained and supports continuation of its much-needed modernization process. The third priority is reforming how the department does business. I am devoted to gaining full value from every taxpayer dollar that's spent on defense, thereby earning the trust of Congress and the American people. We have begun implementation of a range of reform initiatives directed by the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, and we are on track to enter into a full agency-wide financial statement audit as required by statute. I urge Congress to support the Department's request for authority to conduct a 2021 base realignment and closure, or BRAC round. I recognize the careful deliberation that members must exercise in considering this, but BRAC is one of the most successful and significant efficiency programs we have. We forecast that a properly focused base closure effort will generate $2 billion or more annually. And over a 5-year period, that would be enough to buy 300 Apache attack helicopters, 120 F-18 Super Hornets, or 4 Virginia-class submarines. The fourth priority in the FY 2018 budget request is keeping faith with service members and families. Talented people are the department's most valuable asset, but we must continually balance these requirements of investment in our people against other investments critical to readiness, equipping, and modernizing the force to ensure the military is the most capable warfighting force in the world. Investment in military compensation, blended retirement, the military health system, and family programs are essential to fielding the talent we need to sustain our competitive advantage on the battlefield. Our fifth priority is support for overseas contingency operations. The fiscal year 2018 President's budget requests $64.6 billion, focusing on operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, increasing efforts to sustain NATO's defenses to deter aggression and global counterterrorism operations. ISIS and other terrorist organizations represent a clear and present danger, and I am encouraged by the willingness of our allies and partners to share the burden of this campaign alongside us. Moving forward, the FY 2019 budget, informed by the National Defense Strategy, will have to make hard choices as we shape the 2019 to 2023 defense program. The department will work with President Trump, Congress, and this committee to ensure future budget requests are both sustainable and provide the Commander-in-Chief with viable military options that support America's security. In summation, first, I need the BCA caps lifted and a budget, not a continuing resolution, passed on time, and elimination of future sequestration cuts so we can provide a stable and adequate way ahead on budgets. For those who are concerned we are not asking for sufficient dollars, please consider the following. For 2017, as a supplemental, we asked for $30 billion, and the Congress provided $21 billion for our administration to address readiness shortfalls. Second, this fiscal year, President Trump has requested $574 billion plus $29 billion in the Department of Energy budget, plus $65 billion for overseas contingency operations. This is a 5% growth over what the department had for 2017. This request is $52 billion above the Budget Control Act's defense caps. We have underway at this time a national security strategy review, and that will give us the analytic rigor to come back to you for the FY19 to FY23 budget requests, when we will build up our military to confront the situation that the chairman and I have laid out in our written statements. I am keenly aware that each of you understands the responsibility we share to ensure our military is ready to fight today and in the future. I need your help to inform your fellow members of Congress about the reality facing our military and the need for Congress as a whole to pass a defense budget on time. Thank you, members of the committee, for your strong support over many years and for ensuring our troops have the resources and equipment they need to fight and win on the battlefield. I pledge to collaborate closely with you for the defense of our nation in our joint effort to keep our armed forces second to none. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Chairman Dunford is prepared to discuss the military dimensions of the budget request.
General Dunford.
Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Mattis and Undersecretary Norquist with you today. I'm honored to represent your men and women in uniform, and it's because of them I can begin by saying with confidence that your armed forces remain the most capable in the world. However, the competitive advantage that the United States military has long enjoyed is eroding. And a number of factors have contributed to that erosion. Chairman McCain, you mentioned several of these in your opening comments. Since 9/11, an extraordinarily high level of operational tempo has accelerated the wear and tear of our weapons and equipment. Meanwhile, budget instability and the Budget Control Act have forced the department to operate with far fewer resources than required for the strategy of record. As a consequence, we prioritize near-term readiness at the expense of replacing aged equipment and capability development. We also maintain the force that consumes readiness as fast as we build it. We lack sufficient capacity to meet our current operational requirements while rebuilding and maintaining full-spectrum readiness. The Secretary and the service chiefs have addressed that dynamic in their testimonies, and I fully concur with their assessments. But beyond current readiness, we're confronted with another significant challenge that I assess to be now near term. While we have been primarily focused on the threat of violent extremism, our adversaries and potential adversaries have developed advanced capabilities and operational approaches specifically designed to limit our ability to project power. They recognize that our ability to project power is the critical capability necessary to defend the homeland, advance our interests, and meet our alliance commitments. Secretary Mattis alluded to, Russia, China, and Iran have fielded a wide range of cyber, space, aviation, maritime, and land capabilities specifically designed to limit our ability to deploy, employ, and sustain our forces. Russia and China have also modernized their nuclear arsenal, while North Korea has been on a relentless path to field a nuclear-armed ICBM that can reach the United States. In just a few years, if we don't change the trajectory, we will lose our qualitative and our quantitative competitive advantage. The consequences will be profound. It will affect our nuclear deterrence, our conventional deterrence, and our ability to. Alternatively, we can maintain our competitive advantage with sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding. To that end, the FY18 budget is an essential step. However, this request alone will not fully restore readiness or arrest the erosion of our competitive advantage. Doing that is going to require sustained investment beyond FY18. Specific recommendations for FY19 and beyond will be informed by the forthcoming National Defense Strategy. However, we know now that continued growth in the base budget of at least 3% above inflation is the floor necessary to preserve just the competitive advantage we have today, and we can't assume that our adversaries will stand still. As we ask for your support, we recognize the responsibility to maintain the trust of the American taxpayer. We take this responsibility seriously, and we continue to eliminate redundancies and achieve efficiencies where possible. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you this morning, and more importantly, thank you for ensuring that American sons and daughters never find themselves in a fair fight. And with that, Chairman, I'm prepared to take questions.
Secretary Norquist.
Mr. Chairman, I have no separate opening remarks.
Thank you. Secretary Mattis, the committee received unfunded requirement lists from each of the military services, amounted more than $31 billion. Have you reviewed those unfunded requirements list?
I have, Chairman.
Do you agree these are military requirements that should be funded?
Chairman, I think we have our priorities right in the base budget, but I've reviewed the unfunded requirements. I believe it's $33 billion, and I think if we were to receive more money, those requests are appropriate.
I guess my question is it your request that we give you $31 billion more?
Chairman, I'm here to defend the budget as it stands because I can defend every priority there. If the Congress were to allocate additional funds to national defense, I believe the unfunded priority list gives good priorities.
So you're satisfied with what is basically a 3% increase in budgetary requirements?
Chairman, when it comes to defense, sir, we, at this point, I think that the President's budget is allocated appropriately to the priorities. The priorities listed by the service chiefs as we go more deeply into the readiness challenge are certainly well tuned to what we need. I'd be happy to see more money if the Congress was to allocate additional funds and along the lines of the unfunded priority list.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to cooperate, but a lot of times we depend on your recommendations in shaping our authorization and appropriation.
Yes, sir. I can't think of any priorities I'd put in place of the unfunded priorities list if we are given additional money, sir. That would be a decision by you. I have to represent the President's budget since he's having to deal with a wider portfolio than just defense.
Well, let me put it this way. Will this 3% increase give you the confidence that we need, that we are doing everything we can to make sure that our men and women serving in uniform are adequately equipped and trained and ready to fight?
Chairman, it took a good many years to get into the hole we're in. It will not be enough in itself to take us where we need to go. It's going to be a campaign, as I laid out, that started with our request for an additional $30 billion during this fiscal year, the growth that we have in the 2018 budget, and when I get done with the defense strategy and review that, we'll be coming back to you for more, and probably along the lines of close to 5% growth, 3 to 5% growth for 2019 to 23. But no, it will not take us the whole way. It's in the right direction.
It's now mid-June. Congress hasn't passed a fiscal year 2018 budget, something that should embarrass every member of the Senate and House. Neither the House nor the Senate has started drafting or considering appropriations bills because there's no resolution of the top line. This body knows what needs to be done, a bipartisan budget deal to set the budget levels, but has refused to begin such work. If we don't begin negotiating today, it's very likely the military will once again begin the fiscal year on a continuing resolution. What would be the impacts of starting this year on a continuing resolution at the Budget Control Act levels, or $52 billion less than your request?
Chairman, it can only worsen the readiness situation we face now, which has been laid out starkly, I believe, by the service chiefs, if we go in with a continuing resolution.
First conversation that you and I had was about a strategy for Afghanistan. We're now 6 months into this administration. We still haven't got a strategy for Afghanistan. it makes it hard for us to support you when we don't have a strategy. We know what the strategy was for the last 8 years. Don't lose. That hasn't worked. Just mentioned in my opening statement. We just lost 3 brave Americans. When can we expect the Congress of the United States to get a strategy for Afghanistan that is a departure from the last 8 years, which is don't lose?
I believe by mid-July, we'll be able to brief you in detail, sir. We're putting it together now, and there are actions being taken to make certain that we don't pay a price for the delay. But we recognize the need for urgency, and your criticism is fair, sir.
Well, I'm a great admirer of yours, Mr. Secretary, and so are those men and women who have had the honor of serving under you. But we just can't keep going like this. You can't expect us to fulfill the 3 requirements that you gave: funding increase, pass a budget, present a stable budget, if you don't give us a strategy. And I hope you understand that I'm not criticizing you, but there are problems within this administration. I was confident that within the first 30 to 60 days, we would have a strategy from which to start working. So all I can tell you is that unless we get a strategy from you, you're going to get a strategy from us. And I appreciate our wisdom and knowledge and information and all of the great things, with the exception of some to my left here. But the fact is, it's not our job. It's not our job. It's yours. And I have to tell you, the frustration that I feel is obviously palpable, because it's hard for us to act when you don't give us a strategy, which then leads to policy, which then leads to authorization, which is our job. So I hope you understand that we're going to start getting more vocal in our criticism of not having a strategy for Afghanistan. Do you agree that we're not winning in Afghanistan?
Sir, I understand the urgency. I understand it's my responsibility. We're not winning in Afghanistan right now, and we will correct this as soon as possible. I believe the 3 things we are asking for stand on their own merit, however, as we look more broadly at the protection of the country. But in no way does that relieve me of the need to deliver that strategy to you, sir.
I thank you, General, and I understand very well, as do members of this committee, that some of this is beyond your control. But at some point, we have to say, look, the Congress and the American people owe the Congress owes the American people a strategy which will then lead to success in Afghanistan. I am sure that the 3 names that I just mentioned in my opening statement, their parents and their wives and their husbands, and their families, their members of their family, are very aware that we have no strategy. So let's not ask these families to sacrifice any further without a strategy which we can then take and implement and help you. I'm fighting as hard as I can to increase defense spending. It's hard when we have no strategy to pursue. So I hope you understand the dilemma that you are presenting to us.
I do, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as we discussed in your testimony and the Chairman in my testimony, even if you get the additional $52 billion with sequestration in place, you would essentially have to turn around and forfeit that in across-the-board cuts. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir.
And those across-the-board cuts would be more disruptive than anything I could conceive, because there would be no prioritization. It would just be taking from the most sensitive programs, in fact, leaving money in programs that might not even need it. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir. It would be injurious, and again, it would sideline both this committee and myself in making wise decisions.
Did you make that point to the President in terms of the ultimate consultation about this budget in his role as Commander-in-Chief?
I assure you, sir, President Trump is keenly aware of this situation.
And what is his position on sequestration?
I'd prefer to speak to mine, sir, because I can speak most authoritatively there. Bottom line is the administration believes that the Congress has to repeal the Budget Control Act and the sequestration that follows.
But wouldn't it be not only appropriate but essential that that be incorporated in the President's budget? Because the ramifications of sequestration are clearly played out in every aspect of the budget. And remaining silent, as I believe he did in the budget, leaves a lot of people wondering what is his real position, or does he even understand what's going on?
Senator Reid, we're part of the executive branch, and Article 1 of the Constitution gives you that authority to deal with that very situation. I think we all know what needs to be done. I've heard it from Republicans and Democrats on this committee for a long time.
But the interesting thing is I haven't heard a clarion call from the President, and also a practical response and solution as to how we not only undo the BCA, but how do you then allocate resources between defense spending, domestic spending, other spending? And without that, again, it goes to the sort of in the same trajectory of no strategy. There's no budgetary strategy here either. It's just Congress do something. And I think the chairman's point is where it's very late in the game. And the ability for us just institutionally to rewrite a budget, to reallocate resources between defense and non-defense, to increase defense spending without any guideline or framework from the administration is, if not impossible, very difficult. Do you sense that?
Senator Reid, we've submitted a presidential budget for the Department of Defense. We believe that is guidance. We've submitted the unfunded priority list from the Pentagon in accordance with the will of Congress, and we believe that is guidance for what we need. Just let me,
final point, Mr. Secretary. I do, like all my colleagues, respect you immensely, but the budget that's submitted will not work. If nothing is done to change BCA and it's silent on BCA, the $52 billion we give you, we will take back, in fact, in a more harmful fashion, even if we didn't give it to you. If we just left the BCA levels, at least you could prioritize. So let me just change the gears for a moment. Have you received direction, you and your colleagues in the national security agencies, from the President to begin intense planning and preparation for what appears to be an inevitable renewal of cyber attacks by Russia against the United States, particularly in the context of elections? Have you received any guidance?
We are in constant contact with the national security staff on this, and we are engaged not just in discussing the guidance, but in actual defensive measures, sir.
And has that guidance, as the President has clearly laid out in some type of authoritative way, the mission to protect the country in this respect, or is it something just collateral to your discussions?
Senator, I'm under no confusion whatsoever of my responsibilities and the organizations I have, National Security Agency and Cyber Command, about what we are supposed to be doing right now, and we're taking active steps on that I can brief you on in closed hearing.
So and General Dunford, I think you testified previously that Russia represents the most significant threat to the United States, not only in their new aerial denial systems that you, I think, alluded to, but also in their cyber operations. Is that still your position?
It is, Senator, and I included their nuclear capability as well as their behavior.
And again, finally, my last few seconds, do you believe that's the position of the President of the United States, that Russia, particularly in all these new dimensions, is the most significant threat to the United States? Mr. Secretary.
Sir, I've I'd prefer to let him speak for himself on that. I can assure you that from law enforcement to the intelligence agencies, and all that information is available and briefed to the President. We're recognizing the strategic threat that Russia has provided by its misbehavior.
But you recognize it. The question is, does he recognize it?
Sir, I've had full support, for example, for the European Reassurance Initiative, where we're sending more troops to Europe. They are not being sent there for any reason other than to temper Russia's designs. I've had full support on the things that we have had to do in order to address Russia's choices.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.